everyone, and welcome back to History 113. So, you might have noticed that my mic is no longer freaking out and making those weird sounds. So, much apologies for, I think it was Module 2, Introduction, and Module 2.1, where every now and then there would be this really high pitched sound. I tried to edit out as much as I could without re recording, pero that lecture was a little patchy, but we're back on track and things are okay again. Ayun. So, what are we going to be discussing today? Well, it's a pretty exciting module because this is the first module which leads us into part 2 of our course. So today's question is, what is a political system to begin with? And this entire module is going to be an introduction to Philippine political systems through time. We're going to talk about the basic assumptions of political systems theory. We're going to try to apply a modified political systems framework to the Philippine past. And as a final note to today's module, we're also going to try to identify different political systems in the Philippine past, both before and during the formation of the Filipino nation state. So you might have noticed that we already do know what the political systems in our past are. Namely, we have our chiefdoms, we have our colonial systems, we have the Philippine nation state. Oh, wait, I missed something. Sultanates. We have sultanates, and then we have our Philippine democratic nation state. However, today we're going to be introducing a couple more details to give us a more full introduction to why it is these particular systems we're studying, what timelines they represent, and what are the key points that we're going to try to tackle for each module that comes after this one. Okay, so we have progressed to part 2, the history of Philippine political systems. Our key questions for today are, how do we bridge political systems theory with historiography so it may be applied to the Philippine past? As a context to this question, it's a little unusual for a History 113 course or a history course to have a framework that it comes along with. And so in this module, I'm going to be justifying it and explaining why this is the approach we took. So if you think about it, as a student, you could approach the course and just listen to everything I have to say and be like, oh, okay, I'll take notes. And then that's what I'm going to answer for the exams. But you could also take a critical approach, which is, how did the instructor handle this course? And is that the way I would have wanted the course to be handled? So there's a lot of debate that comes between those two questions, right? But I think by asking the second question, we become more aware of what forms of training we want to receive, especially as people who, enrolled ourselves into the history program, mostly with intentions of wanting to stay here and wanting to eventually write some form of historical narrative, diba? So after that, of course, we're going to ask ourselves what political systems have existed in the Philippine past and what details can we learn about them to remember a timeline or the order that they come in terms of their chronology. So, therefore, the two modules or submodules for today are to bridge historiography and political systems theory, and then to go over to the Philippine political systems and introduce them a little bit. Okay, here is our outline for today. And here are our key terms. So today we have a couple of terms you want to remember. Of course, political systems theory, which is your more classic theorization from political science, but also our modified political system. What does it look like? How does it operate? How do we define the terms that are in that framework? For instance, political economy, political culture, time scopes, spatial scopes, conceptual. And of course, we want to understand the conceptual origins of this theory. Okay, so in addition to that, we're going to try to trace terms you already are familiar with, but we'll add more information to the concept of chiefdoms, sultanates, colonial systems, and the Philippine democratic state. Ayan. So let's begin with Module 3.1, Bridging Historiography and Political Systems Theory. So there are many questions, of course, in this lecture, but the first one is, bakit nga ba natin kailangan gamitin yung konsepto ng political system para maintindihan yung nakaraan natin? Like, why is it this particular approach and not, the history of social movements and political movements. Well, I've kind of described this earlier, especially in our course overview, and I think in our first synchronous session. But there's just so much to cover if you generally define politics as um, the struggle to order collective mental and material life. So there are so many topics, and we needed to find containers, right? Or certain segments or chunks of discussion points so that we wouldn't be too confused. And these discussion points they couldn't be just random things, right? They had to represent a certain way that life was organized in the Philippines. And so, as I argue in this part of our module, a political system helps give us a conceptual structure to how we understand politics with a focus on what forms society takes or what containers of politics are formed. So, political systems are containers for different political dynamics, which we can kind of distinguish from a different political system, which we'll be describing in a bit now. The second reason is, with some adjustments, of course, it actually has useful parallels to historical concepts like change and continuity, challenge and response. So, by modifying our traditional political systems approach, we have a way of comparing Philippine political systems across time. But how do we describe a political system to begin with? Well, the political system and political system theory assumes that in a given society, there is a way to distinguish long surviving processes through which its constituents take inputs, like demands for certain policies, what they want to happen within that system, into outputs, such as policies. In this course, we are adapting this concept with some revisions that account for historical change through time. This will be introduced in the following slides. Okay, so let's think about the political system as a machine, right? The machine has a way to accept and or reject things we call inputs or political agenda. For instance, in a particular system, how does a political system respond to revolts, for instance? That's a form of input, really. Revolts or even policies that they want to push for, or different cultural systems that will be introduced. And what do they do afterwards? Do they convert them into how do you call this? Do they convert them into actions that represent those inputs, or actions that would contradict what people wanted to happen within that system, right? So it's a very vague idea for now, but we're going to describe that in the following slides. Pero tignan muna natin yung assumptions of modified political systems theory. Okay. Very, very first assumption. Political systems exist. They are identifiable systems of stable human organization in history that we can understand best when we learn about the power relations which govern them. The nation state represents one among many other systems. So there are different containers for politics, and one form of container is the nation state. The second assumption is that despite threats within and outside the system, there is a level of stability which allows you to identify na, okay, yung tawag dito ay yung nation state or yung sultanate or yung chiefdom or yung colonial system. So, there's actually a way that these systems manage external and internal tension so it can continue to exist until the time that it no longer exists, diba? But more or less, there's continuity to its existence. So, the ability for the system to kind of manage those threats was called by one of the political scientists that theorized political systems theory, conversion functions. So, yun yung term niya para dun. Okay, next assumption. Political systems theory can be bridged with history. And this is the assumption that I take. It is possible to bridge the categories of PST with history as a way to track systemic changes in the ways Philippine life has been historically organized. So, there are different historical containers, and we know what those are. Large changes within one system or one container are also considered watershed moments. So, for instance, is there a drastic change in the way people are managed during a certain period of time? For instance, during the Spanish period, was there a shift from one system of economy to another? For example, from the galleon trade to a cash crop oriented parang cash crop oriented economy, and how did that transform life for the people here? So you can see that the Spanish colony continues to exist, but there's a major change within that system. So traces or continuities of old dynamics can be studied even when older systems have collapsed. For instance, up until the present day, we see the manifestations of political systems that no longer exist. Sultanates, for instance, and their effect on history in the Muslim South continues to be an important historical claim for why there should be different forms of politics in some parts of our country. Um, Early chiefdoms, and not even just early chiefdoms, but the evolution of chiefdoms in the history of the Philippines, whether that's in the pre-colonial period or even after, would help us understand why there are certain indigenous peoples groups that have a distinct culture from the mainstream, and how this enriches our concept of the Filipino mosaic of collective identity, diba? So, as you can see, these things, they don't just cease to exist, they will continue to affect the next systems in one way or another, whether economically or maybe even culturally, or maybe even in the tendencies people carry with them politically. Now, what do we mean exactly by stability, though? So, we're trying to argue that there's a system, or that there are systems or containers for politics which have existed, and they more or less are identifiable and stable. But what does this mean? Although they are identifiable, the level and reach of authorities fluctuates widely in historical political systems, even in the Philippine nation state. What do we mean by this? Although you can say there is such a thing as the Philippine Spanish colony, there were some areas that the Spanish were unable to colonize successfully. So that just because they were unable to colonize those spaces doesn't mean that the colony did not exist. And that's what I'm trying to say, no. In reality, political systems are not as straightforward as they seem when you're looking at events on the ground. Just because a particular nation state claims its territory to be within this land and within the sea, it doesn't mean that they will always be successfully able to control that territory, as we know with our history of disputes over the West Philippine Sea, diba? But nonetheless, we know that these entities have historically existed. And we'll talk about that fluctuation when we get to each module that's dedicated to those systems later on. So, when we are trying to identify a political system, here are the questions that we are trying to trace. No, so the political systems theory, which we'll describe later on, its intellectual origins, is really something that emerged to describe mostly the nation state. However, because we are applying it to different containers in the past, we need to ask questions that are related to historical investigations. So, here are the questions that help us bridge history with political systems theory. On one hand, we can ask about the methods of organization that we're studying with the question, how has the Philippines been organized politically in the past? Pretty straightforward. The next thing to ask is about political processes. If these methods of organization result in a particular system of rule, what processes in society keep the systems functional? So, and this is kind of like, this is why we have a module that focuses on Philippine revolution and upheavals. You might notice, no, I didn't really put the Philippine Revolution as its own political system because it wasn't successfully able to establish a political system right after the revolutionary period. It tried, and we'll be looking at that. The Philippine revolutionary government attempted to create a structure where they had an army, they had a civilian government, and they had a national and local administrative structure. So right before the Filipino-American War, the Philippine revolutionaries were actually trying to push for elections on the ground. So there were elections happening in different municipalities and provinces that had been successfully taken from the Spanish. So that's what was happening. Anyway, so that's what I mean by political processes. Even in instances where there is an attempt to create a political system, one of the first things that you see happening is they try to put processes into place that will allow that system to continue to exist and to continue to function. Okay. So now that we can identify how these systems have, or what the systems are, how they function, the next questions have to do with change and continuity. For instance, how and why did watershed events affect these political systems? So while they were, you can think about watersheds or big moments, turning points in several ways, right? You can look at the turning points which establish a system, and then the turning points which contribute to the fall of the system, diba? When it ceases to exist, when it stops existing. But there are many other turning points in between. As we mentioned earlier, major transformations that shift the way life is organized under the same banner or under the same category of political systems. But besides change, we also know that history tells us about certain continuities or ways that practices, beliefs, attitudes are carried over into future ways of life. So here's the question for historical continuity. Are there political processes which have shaped Philippine history across different periods? Na, we might call them something different, but if the overall way that they operate is the same, then maybe this tells us about a long surviving pattern when it comes to Philippine politics.